One of the most important moments in the 20th century was World War I, or as they called it then, the Great War. For the people in World War I, there was no idea that it would be followed, especially at the end after all the death and destruction. What these notes today are going to look at is what caused it. How did World War I start, and also how did the United States end up joining this huge conflict? All right, so to begin with, the war in Europe. What all is going on? Well, there's several causes to World War I. And so first we'll look at some of the background causes. One of the biggest causes of World War I was this spirit of nationalism that existed in Europe. Nationalism is pride in your ethnic group, pride in your nationality. And it was a good thing for people that were in these nation states like Germany, where everyone is German, or France, where they're French, and so on and so on. That was uniting these countries, a common people who felt they had a common purpose. But it was also tearing apart countries that were empires, like Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had conquered different peoples throughout Europe. And so within this one country, you have people that are Polish, you have Czechs, you have Slovaks, you have Serbs, you have Romanians, you have all these different ethnic groups, everybody with their own culture, their own language, their own desire for independence, and their own nation state. And it was tearing Austria-Hungary apart. Another one of the background causes was imperialism. This idea that these countries in Europe had to take over stuff. And it was fine when there was plenty of places around the world that were open and available to be conquered. But at some point, their colonial borders began running up against each other, and the desire to take territory now is going to mean taking it from another European imperial power. And that's going to cause a major conflict. Finally, another one of these long-term background causes is militarism, or what we might refer to as an arms race. Each nation was building up their military. As new military inventions, new technology was created, your military had to have it because you knew the country next to you was going to get it. And so you had to have more, you had to have better weaponry. When they found out you had better weaponry, they're going to improve their military technology, which forced you to improve yours, and so on and so on. And as these militaries continued to grow, what good is it to have a huge military if you aren't going to use it? And so all these were problems. These are problems going on. They're going on for 25 or 30 years before World War I starts. All we're waiting is for somebody to light the spark. And so we have that immediate cause. What started World War I? Very simply, in June of 1914, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, a guy named Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated. Why is he important? He was the heir to the throne of Austria. He will be the next emperor. As they start investigating his assassination, I mean, they caught the guy who did it. And they found, the Austro-Hungarian authorities found that the group that had perpetrated the assassination was known as the Black Hand. The Black Hand was a Serbian nationalist group that was financed by Serbia. And so you had the nation of Serbia providing funds to a terrorist organization who just killed the heir to the Austrian throne. And so, after about a month, Austria, when Serbia did not satisfy their demands, Austria declared war on Serbia. And once that happened, this thing called the alliance system kicked in. And when the alliance system kicks in, the rest of Europe is going to be dragged into war as well. And so what ends up happening is Europe is divided between the middle, the central powers as they'll be called, and then the allies on both ends.
So I hear you went to the front. Yeah.
Not so nice, is it?
No. This is an ugly war. Ugly's not the word for it. Truth is, I still can't figure out what this war is about.
Nobody knows what it's about.
It's simple. The Germans invaded Belgium. Your homeland.
So they could invade France, your homeland.
What about Russia?
Don't forget Britain. They're on our side.
Look. France is on the left. Russia is on the right. The sausage is Germany, okay? Now, this is Austria. The potato is Belgium, and the beer is Britain. Here, we have Serbia. Now, when the Archduke of Austria is assassinated in Serbia, Austria threatens to invade Serbia.
What about Germany?
Germany, as an ally of Austria, declares war on Russia and of Serbia.
But we're fighting in France.
Yes, indeed we are. France declares war to Germany and Austria because of their alliance with Russia.
What about Belgium?
Belgium. When Germany went to attack France, Belgium was on the way.
And Britain didn't like that, so they joined against Germany and Austria.
Right.
So we're fighting to protect Serbia. A tiny country no one's ever heard of. That's what this war's all about?
Now, the major sides in the war. The major sides are really simple. There's basically two sides. You had the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And just so you know, all four of these would call themselves empires. They each had an emperor who was in charge. Opposing them are the Allies, and the major allies at the beginning of the war are Britain, France, and Russia. These are the major powers. We will leave out the other powers just for the sake of time. We, the United States, would maintain our neutrality at the beginning of this war. Okay. Now, there's several different reasons why we decided to remain neutral. I mean, why would we sit on the sidelines in this war, which in July of 1914 was thought it was going to be very short? Each side believed that they had the military might. They would go in. They would easily defeat the other side, and the war would be over by Christmas. So why would we remain neutral? Well, a lot of it has to do with numbers. 1/3 of the U.S. population had direct ancestral connections to one of the major sides. Okay, 1/3 of our population was British, French, German, or Irish. Why does Irish matter? Well, the Irish many years ago had been conquered by Britain. Ireland was not an independent country in 1914. The Irish population, a large number of them, really hoped Germany would win the war. Because if Germany wins the war, maybe in the peace treaty, they can force Britain to let Ireland be independent. And so this is a huge portion of our population that knows which side they are related to and which side they are therefore on. Okay? And so joining one side or another is automatically going to make a very large percentage of the American public angry that we have chosen to go against their people. This is also the Progressive Era. Please do not forget that. The Progressive Era lasts until 1920. And for the progressives, for a lot of the progressives, war was not progressive. It violates our ideas that we're moving forward. Disagreements should be settled by discussion, not through war, not through killing. There's also the economic reality of war. Neutral countries, according to the rules of war, neutral countries are allowed to trade with both sides. And so, choosing to remain neutral allows the United States to not only trade with the Allies, but also with the Central Powers, and this gives business the opportunity to make more money. We cannot deny that this is a reason why we remain neutral. Okay? The idea of increasing our profits. Now, even though we remain neutral, and remain neutral for a while, we would start preparing for war. As early as 1914, as early as August of 1914, there are several Americans who are out there advocating for the United States to join. We must join. There are reasons we need to join early. Teddy Roosevelt was an early advocate of American intervention in Europe. He thought this was an opportunity for America to assert its world leadership that he thought we needed to take. He would later offer to lead troops in combat in Europe. The military in 1915 started to open training camps and started trying to beef up recruitment efforts with an eye toward eventually getting into the war and having a trained group of soldiers ready. Some Americans who saw the war in Europe as being a fight they needed to be a part of went out and joined either the British Army directly or the French Foreign Legion, and actually did go over in 1915 and helped fight against the Central Powers. Wilson himself is going to openly support American preparedness starting in the middle of 1915. So we have a shift among some people toward preparation and toward the idea of, look, at the very least, we need to be prepared in case war comes to us. Now, the majority of the American public are opposed to the war, even though there are these great patriotic displays and this great patriotic parade from Washington, D.C. The majority of the American people are opposed to the war. Okay? Why are we opposed to the war? One of the huge groups that was opposed to it were the progressive women. They were opposed to the war. You could probably make the argument that women are generally more opposed to war than men. The progressive women helped make that argument. They said that war was invented by men to measure the size of their guns. Okay? And so, to them, politicians who are deciding on war, instead they should take the viewpoint of mothers. Who is being sent off to go fight and die? It's their sons. And what mother is going to want to send her young son out to battle to die? If politicians only took a more motherly viewpoint, they would know that death is always something to be avoided, and they would work out their differences better. This lady is Jeannette Rankin. Jeannette Rankin has a distinction of being the first woman elected to Congress. She was elected in 1916 on a campaign where she promised to vote against any declaration of war. She and the people of her district were so concerned as time went on that the United States was stepping closer and closer to war that she won an election by simply saying, I will vote against any declaration of war. William Jennings Bryan, who we have talked about over and over again, we last saw him as Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. William Jennings Bryan resigned in protest in 1915 as he saw Wilson moving, he believed, closer and closer to war. And Bryan said he would not work for an administration that would move toward war. There is also the Socialist Party. They, of course, are opposed to the war. They had a different viewpoint on it, but it's one that resonated with a lot of people in the United States. Don't forget, in 1912, the Socialists got roughly 1 million popular votes. So there's a huge number of people that were supporting them. The socialists argued that war was always fought by the workers for the profit of the business owners. So it's the workers that are doing the fighting and the dying. It's the business owners, the capitalists, that are making all the money or the war profits. And so there were some people who believed this too. And so, like I said, the majority of the American people are opposed to joining the war, especially when news starts coming out about how terribly destructive the war is. But nevertheless, from 1914 to 1917, the United States is going to step by step head toward war. And what I have here, I have the steps toward war. There are lots of these, and I have them in order by which the American people cared. And to be perfectly honest, at the very beginning, we have things that the American people, the general public, aren't thinking about. We're not looking at these things. But they are reasons, even though maybe the public isn't. Okay. So our first reason that we start moving toward war is our economic ties to the Allies. Okay. Thinking mostly Britain and France here. Prior to the war, the Allied countries made up approximately 75% of international trade with the United States. Okay, so 75% of the stuff we send out in the world is going to those Allied countries, which leaves the other 25% not only the Central Powers, but also the other nations around the world that are not involved in this. Okay. Early in the war, within the first few years of the war, the United States banks had loaned money to the different governments. The Allied governments, again, mostly Britain and France, had borrowed $2.3 billion from United States banks. That's a huge sum of money, and that's in 1916 money. I can't even do the math in my head on what that is worth today. At the same time, the banks had also loaned money to the Central Powers, but it only made up $275 million. So to give you an idea, we loaned the Allies $2.3 billion. We loaned the Central Powers $0.2 billion. A huge economic difference. And as World War I dragged on, it became pretty obvious that whoever lost, their economy was going to be totally destroyed. And so whoever lost was not going to pay back their loans. And so would you rather lose $2.3 billion or would you rather lose $275 million? Take your pick. Thus, we are drawn closer to the Allies. Now, again, for the American public, we don't care. Right? Who cares? We can lose money. Let's not get in that. Right? Our next step toward war was our natural foreign relations and our natural diplomatic ties with the Allies, especially Britain. Over and over again, we have described and we have talked about throughout U.S. history the special relationship that exists between the United States and Britain. I mean, we cannot deny we have a shared heritage. We were British colonies. Yes, we fought a revolution. Yes, we fought the War of 1812. But since that time, we have all kinds of things in common. After the War of 1812, okay, since 1914, each nation's foreign policy has many times inadvertently benefited the other. We would work out a trade negotiation with someone that without realizing it also benefited Britain. They would do the same thing with us. And so we had these natural ties to each other. We had worked together previously in foreign affairs. The Monroe Doctrine, which we've talked about several times. The United States issued it. Europe must stay out of the Americas and must no longer colonize over here. The British are the ones that not only came up with the idea, they were also the ones that had enforced it for us at a time when we did not have the capability to enforce it. And also, several years before, when the United States had gotten into the Spanish-American War, every single country in Europe sided with Spain. Now, of course, they didn't help fight, but they were sympathetic to Spain. Britain was the only country in Europe that was sympathetic to the United States and wanted to see us win that war. So we have these natural ties to Britain. Again, the American public doesn't care. Where we do begin to care is the Allied propaganda. Britain and France, because of the way this thing called the transatlantic cable. The transatlantic cable is the telegraph cable that stretches from North America to Europe, and it runs through Britain and France. Therefore, they control all news that comes out of Europe. And so they can send over news reports. The problem is those reports will be filled with propaganda. And so they will emphasize the brutality of the Germans. Okay? Here we have this drawing of the execution of a nurse named Edith Cavell. She was in Belgium, which had been invaded by the Germans, and she is arrested, accused of helping British and French soldiers and civilians escape the Germans, and she is executed. Now, according to the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Convention, one of them had already happened before World War I. Anyone who actively participates in helping shelter enemy soldiers can be arrested and tried for espionage, for spying. Her execution in international law is pretty legal. But the fact she's a nurse, and she was just trying to take care of people, and so the British and the French would emphasize this brutality. Occasionally, they would either completely exaggerate a story or plant blatantly false stories in the American media, portraying the Germans as really more brutal and cruel than they really were. And in reality, this propaganda was so effective and so good that 25 years later, when World War II starts and information starts coming out about the concentration camps, many people in America at first did not believe that was going on because they said, oh, this is just the same kind of stuff we heard from World War I, and it wasn't true then. Surely it can't be true now. Little did we know that World War II is a completely different ballgame. But this is World War I. Okay? We also, there were some German efforts at sabotaging railroads and shipping areas within the United States during the war. And so, you combine that propaganda with the news stories that are coming out of the United States. Germans were arrested trying to blow up a railroad. That makes for some serious propaganda, and Americans start to think. Now, something else that's gonna help move us and shift the American public opinion into the idea that the war was okay was Woodrow Wilson's idealism. And maybe this is his personal thing shifting him, but also to a certain extent the way he was able to sell this. Going to war, joining the war, was an opportunity for the United States to guarantee what Wilson called peace without victory. Now, what does that mean? What that means is we don't have any losers. We need to figure out a way to end the war. The war has gone on long enough. Plenty of people have died. It is time to just stop shooting. Well, nobody wants to be the guy that lost. So Wilson thought that maybe we could get in and we could create a situation where there wouldn't be any losers. We would negotiate something where everybody would say, look, we're all walking out of this with a win. If you do that, nobody's angry. Nobody has a grudge. Nobody says, well, 20 years ago when I lost and now I want to get even. And if you don't have that, Wilson felt that we could create a lasting peace. Something where there would not be another war like this again. Okay? Wilson was also hoping that once the war was over, the nations could create some kind of international peacekeeping body that would be designed to prevent wars like this from ever happening again. And if he could do that, then he would have kind of an international legacy. Wilson also saw this as kind of this idealistic rose-colored glasses thing of it's all the democracies versus all the dictatorships. Okay? Britain's a democracy. France is a democracy. The United States is a democracy. Russia was an empire until March of 1917. When the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, he abdicated. And a democratic government took over in Russia and continued the war. And so now it really was all the democracies versus all the dictatorships. Oh, how wonderful this would be. Now here's the deal. These first four things, the American public doesn't care. Okay? These things are not going to move the American public into a call for war. Okay, so from 1914 to 1916, even though these things are happening behind the scenes and they're starting to move people, the majority of the American public, on January 1st, 1917, still opposed the war. Until the Germans were using something called unrestricted submarine warfare. Know this. No unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare is where the Germans, German U-boats, German Unterseeboats, German submarines, would go out into the Atlantic and they would attack ships headed toward Britain. The German plan was to starve Britain out. The problem for the Germans from the propaganda point of view is they were sinking anything that was headed to Britain, including neutral ships. So American cargo ships will be attacked. They also make the miscalculation of sinking passenger ships. The most famous ship sunk in this unrestricted submarine warfare program was the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger ship. It was coming from New York to Britain. And on May 7th, 1915, it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Roughly 1,200 passengers and crew on board the Lusitania were killed. About 130 of them were American citizens, and of those, about half of those American citizens were children under the age of 5. This was a catastrophe, a great loss of life. Okay? 1,200 civilians being killed. Now, please note over here, this advertisement for the Lusitania. Please note that a notice had been placed by the German embassy that they were traveling into a war zone. But even though that warning was placed there, who thinks a passenger ship is going to come under attack? No one. This is who would attack a passenger ship? No one, certainly. Now, Germany is going to continue this. They do it again in March of 1916. They sank the ship, the Sussex. And after the Sussex was sunk, the United States government complained so loudly and began making gestures like we're thinking about going to war, that Germany actually suspended unrestricted submarine warfare. From March of 1916, Germany stopped unrestricted submarine warfare. They announced that they would no longer sink neutral ships, and that any British or Allied ships that they saw, they would give a 15-minute warning. The problem is, with the neutral shipping coming in, bringing supplies to Britain, and the British flagged passenger ships bringing other supplies in, the Germans realized that they couldn't effectively starve Britain out. So on January 31st, 1917, Germany announced that they were going to resume their unrestricted submarine warfare attacks against all Allied shipping and neutral shipping, without warning, putting American lives and ships in danger. This is where the American public begins to turn. Because all of a sudden, the American public goes, wait a minute, why would you attack an American ship? Neutral shipping, even though it may be supplying weapons to your enemies, is legal and allowed under all the rules of war. The next step toward war was this thing called the Zimmermann telegram, or sometimes it's called the Zimmermann note. What this was a telegram from Germany to Mexico, encouraging Mexico to declare war on the United States. Now think of it like this, Germany is over there fighting the Allies in Britain. The United States is inching closer and closer toward getting into this, and all of a sudden Germany goes to somebody who ain't involved and says, hey, we want you to declare war on these other people they're not involved yet. The whole purpose of it was that if Mexico declares war on the United States, then all of a sudden the United States has to fight Mexico. And that makes the United States busy, and that puts the United States in a position where we can't join the Allies. We can't join the war. Germany would then have the opportunity to win in Europe. If the Allies had not gotten reinforcements, if we had not joined, then it's possible Britain and France would have been closer and closer to surrender. Germany might have been able to force the issue and force a surrender, at which point they would then send troops and supplies to help Mexico in their war against the United States. If they were able to do that, and Mexico was able to beat the United States, Mexico and Germany was able to beat the United States, Germany would guarantee Mexico that in the treaty negotiations, they would be able to reclaim Texas and parts of the Mexican cession. So the Zimmermann telegram is Germany trying to get Mexico to start a war with the United States. And that, for the American public, that was the last straw. That was what pushed us over the edge. So these last two, the unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, for the American public, are the two most important reasons to go to World War I. Don't forget about the other four reasons. There are other people that believe in those and have been pushing for that and saying this is a good reason to go. But for the American public, it's the unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. Now, in 1916, in November of 1916, Wilson had won re-election. His campaign slogan in 1916 was, vote for Wilson, he kept us out of the war. So in November of 1916, the American public is still opposed to war. But by 1917, by the end of January, things have changed. You have the unrestricted submarine warfare, you have the Zimmermann telegram, and public opinion now supports war. A majority of the public supports the war. So in April of 1917, April 2nd of 1917, Wilson is going to go to Congress, and he is going to deliver his address, a message calling for war with the Imperial German government in defense of American rights. Bonus points if you can walk in the room and point to a primary document that has to do with that. In his address to Congress, Wilson says that we needed to make the world safe for democracy. This was about protecting the rights of neutrals This is about making the world safe for democracy. This is about standing up for people that are being oppressed. And so on April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare war. Jeanette Rankin will be one of the people that votes against it. In 1918, she will lose her re-election campaign because she voted against the war, which she had promised she would do. They got her elected to Congress in the first place. But whatever, on April 6th, 1917, the United States formally joined World War I. And that's where we will pick up in class. I hope you got what you need to out of that. Please be sure that you understand those steps toward war and how it is the American public moved from a position of not supporting the war to finally saying, okay.